It's a big day in the life of the 18-year-old prodigy Praggnanandhaa. He's reached the finals of the FIDE World Cup 2023 and now takes on the best player on the planet, Magnus Carlsen. The thing which has helped Pragg to be super strong in this tournament is his calmness, and you can see him absolutely calm at the moment. Sporting a jacket that has the names of his sponsors, Ramco, Waka, which is the Westbridge Anand Chess Academy, and Indian Oil, the boy looks to dethrone Magnus. But Magnus has 5 world titles, 5 world championship titles, but when it comes to the format of World Cup, he has never won the title. And in comes Magnus Carlsen with 2 bottles in his hands. He knows this is going to be a long game, so gets with him a lot of water. The game is about to begin. We have Sridharan Madhusudan, the Indian ambassador to Azerbaijan, making the first move there. 1c4 is what Pragg asks him to play. He wishes the players the best, and we are ready to go. Look at the number of reporters in the background. The clock is pressed. Pragg stays with the same move, c4, that was played by the ambassador, and Magnus writes down his score sheet. He doesn't worry about the time that goes here. He's just calming himself down, adjusts his pieces. This is the first ever time that Pragg has played 1c4 against Magnus, and so Magnus is just calming himself here and goes for e5, the most central move against the English opening, and some people also call it the reverse Sicilian. Pragg goes knight out to c3. And now Magnus has to decide what move he wants to play. Generally, knight f6 makes sense. And Magnus plays his knight out to f6 and presses the clock. He gets up from the board, and Pragg very quickly brings his other knight out. And this often happens in classical game, that the opponent is not on the board, he's moving around. But here Magnus, right in the early stages of the game, goes somewhere. There does seem something wrong with his health. He did look a little bit low on energy. And already 4 minutes have passed since Magnus went off the board. And there he comes back. He writes down the move. Knight f3. And now what does he play? He brings his knight out on the board, and we have the 4 knights here. All knights are developed, and Pragg plays the little pawn move, the fianchetto system. You put your bishop here and you castle. Now black has a couple of ways to play. One is to push the pawn to d5. The other one is to play your bishop out to b4. What does Magnus do here? He plays pawn to d5, very calmly presses the clock. And now we are in the reversed dragon territory. Pragg comes back, instantly takes the pawn. He is well prepared for this encounter. Magnus has to take with the knight, kind of adjusts his queen there, and takes knight takes d5, turns his knight around and presses the clock. Pragg quickly develops his bishop. Now notice how the knight and the bishop team up on this to pressurize this knight in the center. So you have to move, and Magnus plays knight f6. And you can notice that Pragg does not now move instantly. He's thinking. The reason is, in this position, the main move is to put your knight on b6, keeping the f pawn free to go 1 or 2 steps later ahead. But with knight f6, you are into some fresh territory. And generally when chess players look in the distance and do not make their moves quickly, they are trying to recollect their opening prep. And I think that is exactly what Pragg is trying to do here. He plays his pawn up to b4. Very interesting move and a combative move here. Now, if you take bishop takes b4, the tactical justification is that I take this pawn. If you take the knight, I take your knight. That's fine. And if you take my knight, I give you a check. The knight goes back, and I take, and you lose the bishop here. Instead, if you were to take the pawn here directly with your knight, then I simply take the knight here, the pawn here, and white is better there as well. So pawn to b4 is a prepared move by Praggnanandhaa. This has been played before against Magnus by Jan Nepomniachtchi. Magnus has played this opening twice against Nepo and Ding Liren. In that game against Nepo, Magnus had played the move a6, stopping the pawn from going further ahead. But today, he puts his bishop on d6. Very logical move, developing a piece and also defending a central pawn. What could be more natural than this? And Praggnanandhaa now has to decide what is he going to do. He quickly pushes his pawn and attacks the knight. Now the knight can go back to 2-3 spots. One is here, one is right back to where it started off with, and one, it moves forward. Magnus actually moves forward and he tells Pragg, don't take this knight because my pawn will take and attack your knight when it will have no good place to go to. So after knight comes to the center, now the best move is queen a4 and Pragg is well prepared. He plays it quite quickly and tells Magnus that if you castle now, I'll just take and win a pawn. So you need to be careful. You need to decide what you want to do about your knight in the center of the board. Magnus has already taken 20 minutes in the opening and now chops off the knight on f3. Well, you can take this back with the pawn or with the bishop. I believe taking with the bishop just makes so much more sense. You don't want to spoil your structure there. And Pragg quickly takes back, bishop takes. Now if you notice here, the pawn on b5 actually clamps the black pawns. This pawn cannot move forward because the rook would be hanging. This pawn cannot move forward because it would be taken. This pawn can move forward, but it would be pinned. So for the time being, black castles. And he defers his decision about what is to be done to his queenside pawns. Praggnanandhaa thinking about what should be his next move here. He also castles. Generally in the opening, you tend to take time so that you can place your pieces on the most optimum squares. Here, for Magnus, it's difficult to make moves on the queen side. If he moves his bishop out, he loses this pawn. He plays his pawn to a6, but he's not threatening anything because he cannot take the pawn. His rook is hanging. And the moment you move your rook, I can take this. So d3 played by Pragg. He wants to get his bishop out here and pin the knight with bishop g5. And Magnus quickly plays his pawn to h6, stopping any bishop from coming to g5. What does Pragg do next? He brings his bishop from the other side. Now this is a very interesting position. Magnus has 1 hour 11 minutes on the clock. He has some very quiet moves like bishop d7, looking here. And also very combative move, which is bishop h3, hitting the rook. Now, why is this combative? Because if the rook were to move here, then already this is losing because now the rook is defended and white is lost. So you have to play bishop takes pawn. Once you take this pawn, either the rook can move or you can take the rook. Now, if you move the rook, then I take this pawn and I am winning here because my pawn is very strong. So you can't move the rook. You have to play here bishop takes rook. But once you take this, now I have some options. Should I take here with the rook or with the king? If I take the rook, then after pawn takes, black is doing fine because knight takes and now bishop takes here. This is a fine position for black. So if you now were to take with the rook, then in this variation, I can play pawn takes, queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes, bishop takes, it takes, everything is taken, and in the end this pawn hangs. However, if you don't take here with the rook, but rather take with the king, then what happens is after pawn takes, queen takes, and now black takes this bishop, and there is kind of a double attack that's coming up here. This just goes to show the variation. It illustrates how complicated this move bishop h3 is. And you can see Magnus very calmly thinking in this position, because if you are not aware of the opening and you are thinking here, bishop h3 is a move that you have to calculate very carefully, or else you can get into a losing position. We have put a time lapse of this to show how long Magnus thought here. From 1 hour 11 minutes, he's already down to 55 minutes. In fact, he's going further down, and he feels this is the critical moment of the game where he needs to invest his time. That's the reason why he's thinking so much. And now, when the time has come down to 43 minutes, he finally makes his move, rook to b8. Very interesting decision by Magnus, a calm move played after 28 minutes of thought. As they say in chess, most of the lines remain beneath the surface. You can't take this pawn because after bishop d7, queen b3, ba6, you are in trouble. So that's the reason why Pragg first took the bishop. It makes complete sense. And now if queen takes, I can take the pawn and spoil your structure. There will be two isolated pawns. So he takes here with the pawn, sort of bringing them all together. And now Pragg can take here. Instead, he goes rook to b1, which is a logical move that he has played. And now he wants to bring his other rook here. What one can feel after seeing this position is that white feels much better coordinated. Black still has work to do in order to equalize the game. And we have to see how a player of Magnus's caliber equalizes. He takes the pawn. And now, if you take with the rook, it's a mistake because bishop d7 and you lose material. But you can take with the queen or with the knight. Pragg now decides to play queen takes pawn. And the queen is well positioned. It puts pressure here along with the bishop. Also, pushing the pawn is impossible because there are 3 attackers on that square. So he goes bishop to d7 and he attacks the queen. Now, this queen needs to decide where to go. It can go back here, here, or it can also move forward, offering a queen trade. Pragg goes queen b6. And notice what he wants is after queen takes queen, rook takes, he wants to bring the other rook and put a lot of pressure here. There is an equalizing line here, attack the knight, and next move put the bishop here to equalize. But Magnus actually is thinking for some other solution and he plays his bishop directly. Very interesting move. Because now, after bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, queen takes, now rook can come here and simply chop off this knight. So Pragg cannot be greedy and just win a pawn. It's impossible to do that. So he takes the queen, which is fine, and Magnus will recapture back. He takes back with the rook. And now Pragg can take the bishop on c6. That seems like the strongest move here, so that black does not play the move d5 and then the bishop and the knight are not so well placed. So he takes here, pawn takes, and now we reach a very important structure. Black's pawns are all together. White has one pawn which is outside. Now it could either be a weakness or it could become a strength because it's a passed pawn. No one can stop it. So Pragg can actually do this takes, and bring his other rook and go into this knight endgame, which we do not know what it is like. But Pragg says, I don't want to risk it right now. I'll just go king g2 and I will wait for what Magnus wants to do. So he just improves his king. Maybe the king can be useful later. It's a good move. Magnus quickly brings his rook to a8 and says, no exchanges. I want to now play my rook here, attack your knight, put pressure on your lonely pawn, and bring my other rook to bear down on that open file. Pragg has to decide now where does he go, and he has a move in his mind. And you can see chess players often, they lift their hand, they do not make the move because they're thinking and they're not yet sure. Finally, Pragg moves his rook to b6 and attacks the pawn on c6. And he wants to bring his other rook now. This is the point. Pragg can bring his other rook here, then move his rook up, and then defend this and also attack here. Rook goes to c8, defending the pawn on c6. And now Pragg brings his rook to c1. If the knight had a good square to move to, you could put pressure here. But the moment this knight moves, the pawn on a2 falls. So it's quite impossible to move the knight. Magnus plays his pawn to d5 and he builds a very strong center here. One thing that black is not particularly happy about is his knight here. It's not doing so well on that square, and Pragg quickly defends this with his rook. You will see that he's ready now to move his knight away, maybe to a better square which looks at all of black's weaknesses. Magnus has to think about his knight and he quickly gets it to d7. Now this knight is actually on a trip. From here it wants to jump here, wants to go here, and eventually look at this very juicy square in the center. Rook goes back to b1, and now the knight goes to c5. This knight is actually a little loose and the rook is looking against it, but the moment you try to unleash a discovered attack, the black rook comes and defends it. So there's no real good way to take advantage of this slightly loose knight. So Pragg goes rook c1, and he's saying that now I'm threatening to take because now your knight will be loose. And for Magnus, he has to decide now, because if he moves his knight away, it's still problem because he can lose this pawn and the rook is hanging here. So he cannot do that. He instead brings his rook to a5, defending it here once, and if you take here, then there will be two defenses on the knight from both the rooks. So the knight now is in the way, and Pragg quickly drops it back to b1, and if he manages to get this knight to d2, it would be great. Magnus brings his knight to e6. Now he's looking to come here, and I think the most natural move to expect is take, and take here when black is completely fine. There are no problems in this position. Instead, Pragg goes knight d2, and Magnus writes down the move, and you will notice that he's slightly surprised because in his mind he thought this was not possible as this was hanging, but Pragg had prepared this very nice move, knight b3, attacking the rook. So if you take here, I take here, and that's the reason why he plays rook a8. And with this, you are giving up your pawn here, but you are also going to take the pawn on a2. And now Pragg is deciding what is the next step. He goes knight to f3, and he tells Magnus that if you take here, I'll take this pawn and I'll put a lot of pressure on the c6 pawn, which would be very good for me. So Magnus says, I'm not going to allow that. I'm pushing my pawn here, making you move your knight. Your knight cannot go to d4. My knight's looking there. Yes, you can go to e5. It's possible. But Pragg decides to take the pawn. He captures it, and now Magnus will of course take it back. He takes back the pawn. The knight is attacked and he comes back. So Pragg says, now Magnus, you have this weakness and also this weakness. How are you going to take care of everything in your position? Magnus says, I'm going to give up the pawn, because if you take here, then I take this, and you have very weak pawns here in the center. So clearly Pragg's idea was not to take the pawn, but instead he goes knight c4, forking the rook and the pawn. Very nice move. Magnus snatches the pawn on a2, and Pragg now snatches the pawn on e3. The pawns are traded, and now Magnus brings his knight to the center of the board, attacking the rook and the pawn. One way to go about this position now is to simply take, and bring your rook up. That's exactly what Pragg does. He takes. There's very little material left on the board. Optically, it still feels that white should be better because his pawns are all together. However, these pawns are going to be traded. Rook comes to c4, attacking the knight. And now, if you take this pawn, I'm going to take the pawn on c6. So he plays his pawn to c5. And now Pragg has to decide what to do. Yeah, he takes the rook, takes the pawn with his rook. Magnus can take with his knight, can take with his rook. He decides to take with this rook and offers a draw. Pragg accepts it immediately, and the first game ends in a draw. Let's hear what the players analyze with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think about what they had to draw, and I suddenly, it hit me. Yeah, bishop d6. I think you have to take a b6.
I was thinking maybe I can start with rook b1 or rook c1. Yeah, that's possible. Get the option.
Because after takes, yeah, like if you go b6, b6, rook b1, takes, b5.
Yeah, I didn't.
I'll have bishop c6 and then queen a6, queen c7.
Yeah. Can you just like
Yeah,
these pieces are just
just really bad. Yeah, I didn't really see it.
I checked this line today, but I kind of remember this bishop a3. Some bishop x3 was there, but
I just don't know.
there should be something. I've seen some takes d4 as well, but I don't think it's really.
Yeah, I didn't really. I thought then like even bishop d7 to queen c6.
Yeah.